Welcome back to Nightfall Notions, where we unravel the peculiar, the forgotten, and the oddly soothing corners of history. If you enjoy these meandering tales of the past, don't forget to subscribe. It helps keep the candle burning in this little corner of storytelling. Tonight, we're stepping into a world often misunderstood, a time wrapped in layers of myth and misconception, the 14th century. Our chapter tonight is titled, The Myth of Medieval Filth, where we'll peel back the grimy veil of history to see what bathing really looked like in an era often dismissed as universally stinky. The 14th century was not, as many assume, a cesspool of unwashed bodies and rotting teeth. The idea that medieval people never bathed is a stubborn myth, one that clings like mud to the boots of history. In truth, bathing in the 14th century was a nuanced affair, shaped by culture, class, and circumstance. It was a time when cleanliness was neither ignored nor obsessive, but rather a practice tangled in practicality, religion, and even a little vanity. Picture this: a bustling town in England, the year 1350. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, baking bread, and yes, the occasional whiff of something less pleasant. But amid the crowded streets, there are bathhouses. Steamy, dimly lit chambers where townsfolk gather not just to scrub, but to socialize. These weren't the Roman-style bathhouses of antiquity, with their marble columns and imperial grandeur, but they served a similar purpose. For a few coins, you could soak in a wooden tub filled with water warmed over a fire, perhaps scented with herbs like lavender or rosemary. The wealthy might even have private baths in their homes, copper tubs dragged before the hearth, where servants hauled buckets of heated water for a leisurely soak. But let's not romanticize it too much. Bathing was work. Water had to be drawn from wells or rivers, heated over fires that demanded constant tending, and then carried, often up narrow staircases, to wherever the bath awaited. For the average peasant, a full-body soak was a rare luxury, reserved for special occasions. More often, washing was a piecemeal affair. A basin of water for the face and hands, a quick scrub of the feet before bed. Yet even here, there was care. People knew that cleanliness warded off illness, even if their understanding of germs was centuries away. Herbal soaps, often made at home with ashes and fat, were common, and linen undergarments, washed more frequently than outer layers, helped keep the body fresh. Then there were the quirks, the little details that make history so delightfully strange. Take the medieval belief that water could seep into the body through the pores, weakening the constitution. This fear, rooted in ancient medical theories, meant some people preferred dry cleaning, rubbing the skin with fine cloths to remove dirt over a full bath. Others believed that certain herbs, like sage, could purify the body from the inside, making up for fewer baths. And let's not forget the role of perfume, not just as a luxury, but as a necessity. Scented oils and pomander were worn to mask odors, but also because pleasant smells were thought to balance the body's humors. The church, ever a dominant force, had its own say on cleanliness. While some clergy preached that excessive bathing was vain or even sinful, others embraced it as a form of spiritual purity. Monasteries often had elaborate washing routines, with monks scrubbing their hands before meals and feet in weekly ceremonies. It was a contradiction, like so much of medieval life, a mix of practicality and superstition, austerity and indulgence. So the next time you hear someone joke about the filthy Middle Ages, remember the bathhouses steaming in the cold air, the herbal soaps lathered on skin, the linen shifts washed and rewashed. The 14th century wasn't a paradise of hygiene, but neither was it the reeking hellscape of popular imagination. It was, like all eras, a time of people doing their best with what they had, scrubbing, scenting, and sometimes just holding their noses and carrying on. And with that, dear listener, we close this chapter. The candle burns low, the hour grows late, but the past remains, waiting for us to dust off its stories once more. Chapter 2: Water, Wine, and Herbal Brews. If you thought bathing in the 14th century was just about dunking oneself in a tub of lukewarm water, think again. The medieval bather was an alchemist of sorts, experimenting with a variety of liquids to cleanse, heal, and occasionally indulge in a bit of vanity. Water was the foundation, of course, but it was far from the only option. The truly inventive, or the extravagantly wealthy, had a whole menu of bathing choices, from humble herbal soaks to the kind of decadent wine baths that would make a modern spa-goer blush. Let's begin with the simplest element, water. It wasn't always easy to come by, especially in larger towns where wells were crowded and rivers sometimes carried more than just fish. Rainwater was prized for its softness, while heated water from a kettle was a luxury not to be wasted. In colder months, melting snow for a bath was a chore so laborious that only the truly determined or the truly filthy bothered with it. And then there was the question of temperature. Too hot, and you risked opening your pores to bad air, a sure way to invite disease, according to the medical wisdom of the time. Too cold, and you might shock the body into imbalance. The perfect bath was a delicate negotiation, but water alone was often deemed too plain, too unrefined for those who could afford better. Enter the herbal infusion, the medieval equivalent of a designer bath bomb. Lavender for relaxation, rosemary for invigorating the senses, chamomile to soothe the skin. These were the staples of a well-appointed bath. Zage was particularly popular, believed to cleanse not just the body, but the spirit. Some bathers even tossed in handfuls of rose petals, not so much for their scent, though that was a bonus, but because they were thought to protect against the plague. Whether it worked or not was beside the point. In the 14th century, hope was as much a remedy as any herb. Then there were the more extravagant options. Milk baths, though rare, were whispered about in courts where nobility had both the means and the inclination to emulate Cleopatra. More common, at least among the elite, was the wine bath. Yes, wine. Not the cheap sour stuff peasants drank to avoid dysentery, but fine, fragrant vintages poured straight into the tub. The idea wasn't just to smell like a vineyard, though that was part of it, but to let the tannins soften the skin and the alcohol act as a disinfectant. Whether it actually did either is debatable, but when you're rich enough to bathe in something most people could barely afford to drink, practicality isn't really the point. For those who couldn't splash out on wine, there were still ways to elevate the experience. Ala baths, though less glamorous, were a thrifty alternative, especially in regions where beer was cheaper than clean water. And then there was vinegar, the medieval multitasker. Diluted in water, it was used as a rinse to kill lice, soothe sunburn, and even lighten hair. Yes, even then, people were fussing about their appearance. A vinegar soak was particularly popular among laborers and soldiers, who valued its sharp sting as a remedy for sore muscles and grime-caked skin. Of course, not all bathing liquids were voluntary. If you found yourself in a medieval hospital, a place more likely to pray over you than prescribe medicine, you might be subjected to a healing bath of urine. Aged urine, to be precise, collected in barrels and left to ferment until it reached peak potency. The logic, if one can call it that, was that the ammonia would cleanse wounds and purify the skin. The reality was that it probably stung like hell and made the patient smell like a tavern's back alley. Still, in an age where medical knowledge was equal parts guesswork and superstition, you took what you could get. And so, whether it was a peasant scrubbing with a bucket of river water, a merchant soaking in rosemary-infused warmth, or a noble luxuriating in a cask of Bordeaux, bathing in the 14th century was anything but monotonous. It was a ritual, a remedy, and occasionally a spectacle. Not everyone had the luxury of choice, but even the simplest bath was a small rebellion against the grime of daily life, a fleeting moment of comfort in a world that offered few. The next time you sink into a tub, spare a thought for the medieval bathers who turned necessity into art, and who knew, even then, that there was more to cleanliness than just water. Sometimes it took a little wine, or vinegar, or, if you were truly desperate, a barrel of something best not discussed at dinner. Chapter 3. Public Bathhouses, Social Hubs of Scandal. If you wanted to find the beating heart of a 14th century city, you wouldn't look to its churches or market squares. Not first, anyway. You'd follow the laughter, the steam, and the occasional scandalized shriek to the public bathhouse. These were not the sterile, fluorescent-lit spas of today, but raucous, humid dens of communal soaking, where social rank, gossip, and questionable life choices all swirled together in the same murky water. The medieval bathhouse was, in many ways, the great equalizer. For a few coins, a merchant could share a tub with a blacksmith. A minor noble might rub elbows with a traveling minstrel, and everyone, regardless of station, could agree that the water had probably seen better days. Privacy was a luxury few could afford, so bathing was a group activity, shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee, with only a thin veil of steam preserving anyone's modesty. Some bathhouses offered partitions or curtains for the bashful, but these were often flimsy at best, leading to more than one accidental revelation when a breeze caught the fabric at the wrong moment. But it wasn't just about getting clean. The bathhouse was where news traveled faster than the fleas hopping off a traveler's cloak. Deals were struck in whispers between soaks, marriages were brokered over shared cups of wine, and political rumors spread like wildfire, partly because the heat made people talkative, and partly because no one could resist a bit of drama when they were already half naked. Some bathhouses even employed musicians to pluck lutes or strum harps in the background, turning the whole affair into something between a social club and a very damp cocktail party. Of course, where there was relaxation, there was also vice. The line between bathhouse and brothel was often blurry, if it existed at all. Many establishments employed bath attendants who offered more than just a good scrub, and it wasn't uncommon for patrons to linger long after their fingers had pruned, enjoying the company of their fellow bathers a little too enthusiastically. Clergy railed against these dens of iniquity, warning that the steam carried not just heat but temptation. Some bathhouses leaned into the reputation, advertising themselves as places where one could wash away sins, sometimes quite literally, depending on how generous the definition of sin was that evening. Then came the backlash. As the century wore on, the bathhouse's reputation shifted from lively to lewd, and then from lewd to lethal. When the Black Death began its relentless march across Europe, many blamed the bathhouses, not entirely without reason. Crowded, poorly drained, and often reusing water until it was more broth than bath, they were perfect breeding grounds for disease. Physicians warned that hot water opened the pores to miasma, the dreaded bad air thought to carry plague. Town councils shuttered them, preachers condemned them, and soon the once bustling bathhouses stood empty, their wooden tubs gathering dust instead of laughter. By the end of the 14th century, the golden age of public bathing was over. What had been a vibrant social ritual became a cautionary tale, a relic of a time when people had been too trusting of shared water and shared company. The wealthy retreated to their private tubs, the poor made do with basins and rags, and the bathhouse, once a place of gossip, camaraderie, and the occasional eyebrow-raising encounter, faded into memory. Yet for a brief, steamy moment in history, the bathhouse had been more than just a place to wash. It was a stage for human nature in all its messy, unvarnished glory. Ambitious, indulgent, and always inevitably a little bit dirty. Chapter 4. The Peasant's Splash. While nobles soaked in wine and merchants debated politics in bathhouse steam, the peasantry faced a far more practical challenge. How to get clean when your entire worldly wealth couldn't buy a bucket of hot water. For the common folk of the 14th century, bathing wasn't a leisurely ritual. It was a logistical puzzle solved with icy rivers, stolen moments of privacy, and a healthy disregard for modesty when the situation demanded it. Picture a village at dawn, the kind of place where chickens outnumbered chamber pots. Here, The morning bath was less about relaxation and more about speed. A woman dashed to the communal well before her neighbors awoke, hauling up a single bucket to splash her face and underarms before the day's labor began. A man might pause at the creek on his way to the fields, scrubbing his hands with sand to remove yesterday's dirt so he could immediately begin accumulating today's. Privacy was laughable, but necessity bred creativity. The truly modest might wait for twilight to wash, though this came with its own risks. Nothing made a person question their life choices like stripping naked in a mosquito-infested stream under a half-moon. For families, bathing was an exercise in improvisation. A single large kettle of water, warmed over the hearth after supper, might serve an entire household. Children were scrubbed in order of age or dirtiness, with the unluckiest going last into what was by then little more than grey broth. Babies got dunked in basins, their protests echoing through cramped cottages while mothers muttered about ingratitude. The elderly got whatever water was left, often just a damp cloth passed over aching joints, a token gesture, but one that still carried the faintest whisper of dignity. Then there were the communal workarounds. In some villages, washing became a semi-public event whenever a rain barrel filled enough to justify sharing. Neighbors would queue with their laundry and their children, gossiping as they waited their turn at the murky water. It wasn't uncommon for disputes to erupt over who had borrowed a bucket without returning it, or which family's toddler had turned the water opaque with mud. But these moments also fostered an unspoken economy of cleanliness. The young widow might receive an extra dipperful from the well. The old shepherd's threadbare shirt might find its way into a neighbor's washpot. Survival required cooperation, even in matters of soap badot. Of course, not all peasant hygiene was quite so charming. Fleas and lice were constant companions, leading to, and occasionally disastrous, remedies. One popular method involved coating the hair in a paste of ashes and vinegar, then wrapping the head in rags overnight. A treatment that left scalps raw but temporarily pest-free. Clothing was cleaned by hanging it in the smoke of the hearth, the theory being that the acrid fumes would drive out vermin. This worked, sort of, if one didn't mind smelling like a burnt sausage for weeks afterward. The truly desperate sometimes turned to nature's bathtubs. Ponds were risky, God knew what else had washed up in them, but during summer droughts even questionable water looked inviting. More than one enterprising villager discovered that the trough meant for livestock worked splendidly for humans, provided one didn't mind sharing with the occasional curious duck. Rivers offered the best solution, their currents carrying away filth even as they threatened to carry away small children. Parents would post lookouts downstream to catch wayward soap or wandering toddlers, creating a system that was equal parts bath time and rescue operation. Yet for all the struggle there were flashes of unexpected luxury. A stolen hour at the riverbank on a feast day, when the water was warm and no one needed to hurry. A pinch of lavender begged from the Lord's garden, tucked into a washcloth to sweeten the scrubbing. The rare indulgence of a new linen shift, scratchy and bright, that made one feel almost noble for an afternoon. These moments were fleeting, but they mattered, proof that even in a life of relentless toil, people still found ways to care for themselves, to claim small victories over the dirt that sought to claim them. In the end, the peasant's bath was never about vanity. It was about perseverance. About hauling water uphill after back-breaking labor because smelling human at Sunday Mass mattered. About mothers scrubbing children raw before the priest's visit, not because they feared hell, but because they refused to let poverty become squalor. And sometimes, in the quiet of an evening, it was about a solitary figure kneeling by a stream, washing away sweat and dust, just to remember what their own skin looked like beneath the grime. The nobles had their wine baths. The merchants had their gossip-filled steam rooms. But the peasant? They had the cold slap of reality, the sharp bite of river water, and the stubborn determination to meet it with a bar of homemade soap and a muttered prayer for warmer weather. In its own way, that was a kind of luxury too. Chapter 5. Nobility's lavish rituals. While peasants made do with frigid streams and shared buckets, the nobility turned bathing into an art form of excess, transforming what was for most a chore into a theatrical production of status and sensuality. In the castles and manors of the 14th century elite, cleanliness wasn't just about hygiene, it was a performance of wealth so ostentatious that even the bathwater became a political statement. The noble bath began with infrastructure the common folk couldn't fathom: dedicated bathing chambers with proper drainage, teams of servants whose sole job was water hauling, and copper tubs so massive they required their own carts when nobility traveled. These weren't mere vessels for washing, but objects of display, often engraved with family crests or inlaid with semi-precious stones. The Duke of Burgundy famously possessed a silver-plated tub that required 6 strong men to carry it, not because it held more water, but because its absurd weight announced his status before he ever uttered a word. Filling these monstrosities was an operation worthy of a military campaign. Servants formed bucket brigades from kitchen fires to bathing chambers, their arms trembling under the weight of scalding water while the noble in question lounged nearby, nibbling sweets and complaining about draughts. The truly privileged had underground pipes feeding their residences from hot springs, a Roman luxury that had survived in scattered pockets of Europe. One Italian countess was said to bathe thrice daily in naturally heated waters piped directly through her marble-floored palazzo, a habit her confessor called sinfully decadent and her rivals called infuriatingly well-connected. The liquids filling these tubs were as important as their containers. Common water was beneath contempt. Noble baths required enhancement. Some preferred milk, though not the thin peasant variety. Only the richest cream would do, often scented with crushed rose petals or ambergris, at such concentrations that bathers emerged smelling like a perfumer's workshop. Others favored herbal decoctions so potent they turned the water opaque, with recipes guarded like state secrets. The Count of Provence's personal blend included saffron, cinnamon, and powdered gold, creating a bath that allegedly cured melancholy but definitely cured anyone nearby of any doubt about his spending habits. The actual act of bathing became a ritualized spectacle. Nobles never bathed alone, not for modesty, but because washing oneself was considered vulgar labor. Teams of attendants stood ready with sponges, scrapers, and towels, their movements choreographed like a dance. A well-bred lady might have her hands and feet washed by one servant while another massaged scented oils into her scalp, all under the supervision of a bathmaster who ensured no inch of skin went unattended. The Bishop of Winchester reportedly employed a deaf-mute attendant specifically for bathing, not out of cruelty, but because a man who cannot repeat what he sees is worth his weight in relics. Soap became a fetish object among the elite. Common tallow soap, fit only for scullery maids. The nobility demanded cakes of Castile soap imported from Spain at ruinous cost, or delicate Venetian bars pressed with floral patterns too pretty to actually use. Some fastidious lords carried personal soap receptacles when traveling, small silver boxes lined with velvet, lest they be forced to touch something a merchant had once used. Queen Joanna of Naples famously received a gift of perfumed soaps shaped like seashells, which she displayed in her chambers, for wantonly permitting their use during a particularly trying bout of fleas. The post-bath ritual could last longer than the bath itself. Attendants would pat the skin dry with linen so fine it felt like mist, then anoint every limb with oils. Some nobles preferred to be wrapped in warm towels for precisely the count of 100 heartbeats before dressing. Others demanded elaborate post-bath treatments, hair combed with ivory picks, nails buffed with ground pearls, skin rubbed with alabaster rollers to prevent unsightly moisture retention. The Duke of Berry's post-bath routine included having his pores inspected by a physician who would proclaim whether the day's perspiration had been sufficiently balanced. Of course, such excess invited backlash. Moralists railed against bathhouse decadence infiltrating good Christian homes. Physicians warned that excessive washing made the body porous and weak. Even among the nobility, factions emerged. Traditionalists who viewed daily bathing as dangerously modern, reformers who insisted one couldn't be truly devout without physical purity. The debate reached absurd heights when the King of France's cousin died after catching chill from an ill-timed bath, leading to 6 months of courtiers pretending they'd never enjoyed hot water in their lives. Yet for all the criticism, the noble bath persisted as the ultimate flex of discretionary wealth. When a lord wanted to impress guests, he didn't show them his silver. He showed them his bathing apparatus. Marriage contracts began specifying bathing rights for brides. The truly cutting-edge installed mirror chambers where one could admire oneself mid-soak. It was decadent, ridiculous, and utterly human. Proof that even in an age of plagues and peasant revolts, those with means would always find ways to turn basic bodily maintenance into an act of glorious steaming vanity. The peasants splashed in streams. The merchants sweated in bathhouses. But the noble, they didn't just bathe, they performed aquatic alchemy, transforming water, herbs, and servitude into liquid, proof that they were, in all ways, above the common tide. Chapter 6. Soap. A luxury or a necessity? In the 14th century, soap occupied a curious place in society, simultaneously essential and extravagant, mundane and mysterious. To the common laborer, it was a humble lump of fat and ash, barely worthy of notice. To the nobility, it could be a perfumed treasure worth its weight in spices. And to the soap makers themselves, it was a craft teetering between chemistry and alchemy, capable of lifting dirt from skin and coins from purses with equal efficiency. The basic recipe for medieval soap hadn't changed much since antiquity: animal fat, wood ash, and patience. Lots of patience. The process began with a collection of ashes, preferably from hardwoods like beech or oak, which yielded a stronger lye. These ashes were placed in a barrel with holes in the bottom, through which water was slowly poured to leach out the alkaline solution. The resulting liquid, corrosive enough to strip flesh from bone if mishandled, was then boiled with rendered fat, often tallow from beef or mutton, though the truly fortunate might use pig fat for a milder soap. After hours of boiling and stirring, the mixture thickened into a crude paste that was left to harden in wooden molds. The final product was harsh, crumbly, and smelled faintly of burnt meat. But it did the job. For peasants, soap making was typically a seasonal chore, undertaken in the autumn when livestock had been slaughtered and hearth fires burned constantly. A single household might produce enough to last the year, stored in a dry corner of the cottage where it wouldn't melt or attract vermin. This homemade soap doubled as laundry detergent, dish cleaner, and occasionally a rudimentary salve for skin ailments. Children hated it, not just for its abrasive texture, but because applying it often meant an impending and inevitable scrubbing in cold water. Woe betided the peasant child caught avoiding wash day. Mothers wielded soap like a weapon, chasing dirt from ears and elbows with the determination of soldiers storming a castle. But soap could also be a luxury item, and this was where the craft took on unexpected sophistication. In cities like Marseille, Venice, and Castile, professional soap makers elevated the humble substance to an art form. Using olive oil instead of animal fat, and adding perfumes like lavender or rosemary, they created soaps that were milder, longer lasting, and, most importantly, pleasant to use. These coveted cakes were exported across Europe, fetching prices that made them inaccessible to all but the wealthy. A Venetian merchant's wife might display her rose-scented soaps in a decorative dish, as much a status symbol as her silver spoon. The nobility took soap obsession to absurd heights. Some lords commissioned personalized batches stamped with their coats of arms, while others demanded soaps in colors to match their livery, an expensive vanity given that natural dyes often bled in water. The Duke of Burgundy's infamous black soap, made with powdered charcoal and musk, was said to cleanse the soul as well as the skin, though it left bathers looking like they'd been rolled in chimney soot. At the opposite end of the spectrum, the Queen of France preferred soap so pale they appeared translucent, requiring milk-fed calves' fat and triple-filtered lye to achieve their ghostly hue. The Church maintained an uneasy relationship with soap. While some clerics praised cleanliness as next to godliness, others distrusted the vanity of perfumed soaps, particularly when used by women. A bishop in Lincoln once delivered a sermon comparing scented soap to the perfumed sins of Babylon. Though this didn't stop his own monks from producing and selling excellent lavender soap in the monastery workshop. The contradiction was typical of the era. Moral condemnation of luxury rarely prevented its quiet enjoyment when no one was looking. Soap-making guilds guarded their trade secrets fiercely. A Marseillais soap boiler might spend a decade as an apprentice before learning the precise moment to add olive oil to the lye. The penalty for revealing these techniques could be exile from the city, a punishment considered worse than fines for men whose families had made soap for generations. Recipes were memorized, never written down, and modified in subtle ways to distinguish one master's work from another. The result was that soap quality varied wildly from town to town. What passed for fine cleansing in London might be considered fit only for scrubbing floors in Genoa. Oddly enough, soap's medicinal properties were both celebrated and feared. Physicians prescribed washing with certain herbal soaps for skin conditions, yet warned that excessive use could open the pores to malign humors. This led to the peculiar practice of some nobles, washing their hands and face with soap daily, while avoiding full-body cleansing for months, a compromise that left them partially clean and entirely missing the point. The plague years only deepened this confusion, with some doctors insisting soap prevented infection while others claimed it attracted miasma. The average person, caught between these theories, often decided that using a little soap couldn't hurt, but using too much probably would. By the late 14th century, soap had become a silent marker of social divides. The peasants' lye-heavy lump, the merchants imported Castile bar, the nobles' perfumed masterpiece. Each told a story about who washed, how, and why. It was a substance both mundane and magical, capable of revealing the contradictions of an era that wavered between superstition and science, piety and vanity. The next time you lather up without a second thought, consider the medieval soap-maker stirring his foul-smelling cauldron, the nobleman unwrapping a precious cake from scented paper, the child wincing as a mother scrubs behind his ears. Cleanliness might be next to godliness, but soap itself was something far more interesting. It was human. Chapter 7. The Church's Damp Dilemma. The medieval church's relationship with bathing was as complicated as a monk's feelings about his vow of chastity during springtime. On one hand, Scripture praised cleanliness. On the other, naked bodies in warm water tended to lead to thoughts even less holy than the average sinner's weekday musings. This theological tug-of-war created centuries of mixed messages, where bathing was alternately encouraged as pious and condemned as decadent, depending on which saint was winning the argument that decade. Early Christian traditions had embraced washing as symbolic of spiritual purity. Monasteries preserved Roman bathing customs longer than secular society, with monks following strict cleansing rituals before prayer. The Benedictine rule prescribed weekly baths, though with typical monastic efficiency. The same water served multiple brothers in sequence, with the abbot going first and the novices bathing in what was essentially brotherly soup. Some particularly devout orders took this further. The Cluniacs were known for their elaborate bathhouses, where running water and heated floors made cleansing as close to pleasurable as anything could be in an institution that also encouraged self-flagellation. But as the Church grew richer and its clergy more worldly, suspicion of bodily pleasures crept in. By the 14th century, a peculiar dichotomy had emerged. Washing for hygiene was acceptable, even commendable, but washing for enjoyment was dangerously close to sin. This distinction rested on the flimsiest of theological scaffolding. A quick scrub before Mass. Godly. Lingering in a tub while servants massaged your shoulders. That reeked of vanity. The logic followed that if you emerged from the water cleaner but not noticeably happier, you'd probably done it right. Public bathhouses became particular targets of clerical ire. What began as practical establishments for people without private washing facilities had, by the 1300s, gained reputations as hubs of impropriety. Church reformers told lurid tales of couples sharing tubs, prostitutes plying their trade in steam rooms, and worse, gambling, drinking, and general merriment occurring where there should only be solemn scrubbing. A Franciscan preacher in Paris claimed bathhouse steam carried not just heat, but lustful vapors that could penetrate even the most virtuous soul. His solution? Cold water baths in the privacy of one's home, preferably while contemplating mortality. Unsurprisingly, this suggestion proved unpopular outside monastery walls. The Black Death worsened the Church's bathing anxiety. As plague ravaged Europe, some theologians posited that hot water opened pores to disease, while others argued dirt itself was protective, a theory that conveniently aligned with their existing distrust of bathhouses. The result was a generation of clergy preaching against excessive washing while quietly maintaining their own ablution routines. The Bishop of London famously banned his priests from public baths while having a private bathing chamber installed in his residence, complete with imported Tuscan soap. When confronted about this hypocrisy, he claimed it was for medical reasons, a loophole wide enough to drive a cartload of indulgences through. Pilgrimage estates capitalized on the spiritual cleansing metaphor, with holy wells and sacred springs, where the faithful could wash away sins literally and figuratively. These spots became lucrative operations, with monks selling bottles of miracle water and renting towels at exorbitant rates. At Canterbury, pilgrims queued to bathe in waters that had touched St. Thomas Becket's relics, despite the bath's resemblance to an overused horse trough. The more skeptical visitors noted that the sacred bath seemed to cure skin conditions, but inexplicably failed to remove ordinary dirt. For women, the Church's bathing advice was especially contradictory. Female saints' lives praised their modest avoidance of baths to preserve virtue, while confessors instructed parishioners that marital duties required basic cleanliness. The practical result was that devout women developed elaborate workarounds, washing only in dim light, wearing shift dresses in water, or employing chastity towels large enough to preserve modesty, while somehow still allowing actual cleaning to occur. A particularly zealous abbess in Normandy required her nuns to bathe in their habits, creating the paradoxical situation of sisters emerging from the water fully clothed, but technically clean. The Church's waffling on bathing had unexpected consequences. When reformers like Jan Hus criticized clerical corruption in the late 14th century, they often pointed to bishops' luxurious bathhouses as evidence of decadence. This backfired spectacularly in Bohemia, where commoners, missing the point entirely, began constructing their own humble bathhouses as acts of rebellion. For a brief, steamy moment, getting clean became a radical act. By century's end, the Church had settled into an uneasy compromise with bathing. It was permissible if done quickly, without pleasure, and preferably while thinking about God. This satisfied no one completely, which probably meant it was the authentically medieval solution. Monks continued their ritual washings, bishops their discreet soakings, and peasants their furtive river scrubs, all equally convinced their approach was the most righteous. Perhaps the final word belonged to an anonymous Franciscan who scribbled in his monastery's margin, "Better a clean body with a dirty soul than the other way around, though ideally neither." It was as close to a bathing doctrine as the medieval Church would ever get. A grudging admission that even the devout had skin, and skin occasionally needed washing. The Lord worked in mysterious ways, but he presumably preferred not to do it, surrounded by body odor. Chapter 8. Bathing as Medicine. In an age where a physician's cure might involve more astrology than anatomy, bathing emerged as one of medieval medicine's more sensible treatments. Though sensible is a relative term when discussing an era that also prescribed powdered unicorn horn for melancholy. The 14th century saw water not merely as a cleansing agent, but as a therapeutic medium, capable of balancing humors, drawing out poisons, and occasionally drowning patients who stayed in too long. The theory behind medicinal bathing stemmed from ancient Greek and Roman traditions, filtered through centuries of monastic scholarship and outright guesswork. Galen's doctrine of the four humors dictated that health required proper fluid balance, and what better way to adjust bodily fluids than by submerging the entire body in specially prepared waters. A yellow bile-dominant individual might be prescribed cooling baths with violet and lettuce, while a phlegmatic patient would suffer through scalding soaks laced with mustard and ginger. The logic was impeccable if one ignored the fact that no one had ever actually seen these mythical humors. Hot springs became the hospitals of the medieval world, their steaming waters attracting everyone from arthritic peasants to gout-ridden nobles. The most famous springs, like those at Bath in England or Aachen in Germany, developed into elaborate spa towns where the sick, the wealthy, and the merely curious jostled for access to the healing waters. Here, physicians prescribed not just bathing but an entire regimen, specific durations, precise temperatures, and exact numbers of submersions per day. The waters of Baden were said to cure infertility if taken while facing east, while the springs of Vichy required bathers to drink as much as they soaked in, creating the paradox of patients simultaneously treating and causing bladder complaints. The actual experience of taking the waters was far from relaxing. Patients at Bath Abbey's infirmary were plunged into stone tanks up to their necks in sulfur-scented water, then left to stew for hours while monks chanted prayers overhead. The wealthy could afford private tubs, but even these came with strings attached. Attendants would periodically add fresh buckets of scalding water to open the pores, resulting in a slow-cooking process that left noblemen as pink and tender as Christmas geese. Herbal baths represented the more sophisticated end of hydrotherapy. Medieval herbals contained countless recipes for therapeutic soaks, ranging from the plausible chamomile for skin irritations to the bizarre dried viper's flesh for trembling of the limbs. Monasteries grew special medicinal gardens specifically for bath preparations, with monks carefully timing their harvests to coincide with astrological alignments. A particularly complex recipe from Salerno's medical school required collecting mugwort at full moon, steeping it in wine for 40 days, then adding it to a bath, taken precisely at midday, an elaborate process that probably cured patients simply by exhausting them into better health. Home treatment provided some of bathing's more legitimate medical applications. Physicians had observed that clean wounds healed better, even if their understanding of why remained mired in theories about water drawing out corrupt matter. Battlefield surgeons would irrigate injuries with warm wine or herbal decoctions, while midwives used sitz baths infused with birthwort to ease postpartum recovery. These practices occasionally worked, though more by accident than design. The boiling of bathwater alone would have killed some microbes, even as physicians credited the effect to planetary alignments or prayer. The line between medicine and magic blurred in certain bathing rituals. Lepers were sometimes treated with silver baths, where coins were tossed into the water to transfer the metal's purifying properties, a costly procedure that mainly demonstrated how little silver actually dissolved in cold bath water. Epileptics might be immersed during caesares, based on the theory that water could reset the body's equilibrium, though this more often resulted in drowned epileptics than cured ones. Most tragically, children with rickets were subjected to prolonged cold baths intended to harden their bones, a treatment that succeeded only in making miserable children even more so. Wealthy hypochondriacs turned medicinal bathing into a lifestyle. The Duke of Milan maintained an entire staff of bath attendants who prepared daily soaks tailored to his ever-rotating list of imaginary ailments. 1 week a rosemary bath for weakness of spirit, the next a saffron infusion for excess night air in the lungs. His physicians humored these whims while quietly treating his actual gout with willow-bark tea, proving that even medieval doctors understood the placebo effect, if not by name. The Black Death transformed bathing's medical reputation overnight. As plague ravaged Europe, many physicians denounced hot baths for opening pores to miasma, while others prescribed frequent washing to prevent infection. The result was complete confusion. Towns where bathhouses were shuttered as pestilent death traps stood next to villages where communal scrubbing became mandatory. Some plague doctors recommended vinegar baths, creating a wave of pickled citizens who stank but at least outlived their unwashed neighbors. By century's end, medicinal bathing had settled into an uneasy compromise, recognized as helpful for certain ailments, but viewed with suspicion as a potential source of indulgence. The wise physician prescribed baths, sparingly, with careful attention to the patient's moral character. A soak that might cure a pious widow could corrupt a young lord with sensual thoughts. As with so much of medieval medicine, the treatment's effectiveness mattered less than its ability to confirm existing beliefs about the body and soul. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of this era was the stubborn persistence of certain bathing remedies. Hot springs continued attracting believers long after humoral theory faded. Herbal baths evolved into modern aromatherapy, and the basic idea that cleanliness could prevent disease eventually triumphed, though it took several more centuries and countless preventable deaths to get there. The medieval bather, whether soaking in hope or desperation, understood one eternal truth. Sometimes the cure really is as simple as hot water and time, even if you have to throw in some astrology and prayer to satisfy the doctors. Chapter 9. The Art of Not Bathing. For all the elaborate bathing rituals and medicinal soaks of medieval Europe, there existed an equally sophisticated culture of avoiding water altogether. People of the 14th century became masters of staying cleanish without actually getting wet, developing an array of creative solutions that ranged from reasonably hygienic to utterly delusional. The art of not bathing was born not from laziness, but from a perfect storm of medical fears, seasonal challenges, and that most medieval of motivators, sheer inconvenience. Winter presented the most obvious obstacle to regular washing. When the temperature dropped and ponds froze solid, even the most fastidious peasant had to reconsider their bathing habits. Hauling water from a half-frozen well, heating it over a temperamental hearth, then stripping naked in a drafty cottage required a level of dedication that few could muster. The wealthy had servants to manage these hardships, but even castle dwellers faced the unpleasant reality that their stone chambers retained cold better than heat. The Countess of Artois famously wrote to her sister about abandoning her weekly bath for 3 straight months, one particularly brutal winter, noting that the grease from roasted capons does wonders for keeping skin supple when water would turn to ice on one's flesh. Medical fears provided another powerful disincentive. The theory that water could carry disease through the skin gained traction throughout the century, especially after the plague years. Physicians warned that hot baths, in particular, opened the pores to miasma, allowing foul airs to penetrate the body's defenses. This led to the curious phenomenon of people who fastidiously washed their hands and face, while avoiding full immersion like the plague, sometimes literally. A school of thought emerged claiming that a thin layer of dirt actually protected the body, creating a natural armor against illness. The logic was impeccable if one ignored the fleas. The impracticality of drying off in cold weather further discouraged bathing. Without modern towels, a bather might spend hours shivering while their damp skin slowly air-dried. Linen cloths absorbed poorly and took forever to dry themselves, leading to households where every chair back was perpetually draped with damp laundry. Some inventive souls tried rubbing themselves with dry bran or oatmeal to absorb moisture, a method that left them technically dry but trailing grain particles like human hourglasses. The truly desperate simply put their clothes back on over wet skin and hoped body heat would eventually do the job, a strategy that worked about as well as one might expect. For women, hair washing presented a particular challenge. Long, thick medieval hair could take an entire day to dry naturally, making frequent washing impractical. The solution was elaborate head-wrapping techniques and the strategic use of scented powders to absorb oil between washes. A noble woman might go months without proper hair washing, relying instead on daily brushing to distribute oils and the occasional application of perfumed rosewater. When full washing became necessary, it was treated as a major event requiring multiple servants and half a day's commitment, medieval blowouts being somewhat more labor-intensive than their modern counterparts. Travelers faced special bathing hardships. On pilgrimage or military campaign, opportunities for proper washing were scarce. Soldiers developed a habit of dry bathing, rubbing themselves with cloths and handfuls of sand to remove the worst grime. Knights in armor famously suffered from armor funk, their padded gambesons growing so foul that opposing forces could sometimes smell them before seeing them. The lucky ones found rivers to rinse in. The rest simply marinated in their own sweat until the next rainfall provided accidental relief. The Church's occasional condemnations of bathing as vanity provided convenient excuses for the already reluctant. A lord who didn't fancy freezing in his chamber could piously declare himself avoiding sinful luxury while still enjoying his servants' meticulous sponge baths. This cognitive dissonance reached its peak with King Philip VI of France, who publicly eschewed bathing as worldly indulgence while maintaining an entire staff of skin rubbers, whose job was to keep him clean through vigorous dry scrubbing with scented cloth. Certain professions developed their own non-bathing traditions. Blacksmiths and other metalworkers often avoided washing altogether, believing the layer of grime protected them from burns. Miners claimed the earth's odors clinging to their skin warded off evil spirits in the tunnels. Fishermen embraced their stench as a form of occupational pride, their wives reportedly claiming they could track missing husbands by smell alone along the docks. The rise of linen undergarments in the late 14th century provided perhaps the most socially acceptable way to stay clean without bathing. The concept was simple. Frequent changes of washable linen shirts and shifts absorbed body oils and odors, while outer layers of wool or velvet rarely needed cleaning. This system worked surprisingly well, assuming one had enough changes of linen and servants to launder them. The wealthy might go through 3 shirts a day, while peasants made do with one carefully rotated set, washing the shirt while wearing the only spare, then reversing the process the next week. Perfume and pomanders became the weapons of choice in the battle against odor without water. Wealthy ladies and dandies carried scented balls of ambergris or cloves to mask unpleasant smells, while the less affluent made do with bunches of herbs tucked into clothing. The truly desperate resorted to rubbing themselves with garlic, not because it smelled pleasant, but because it at least smelled stronger than everything else. A thriving trade developed in strowing herbs scattered across floors to be crushed underfoot, releasing fragrances that poorly masked the accumulated odors of a household. By century's end, the art of not bathing had become its own intricate social dance. The wealthy pretended their rare full baths were medicinal necessities while maintaining elaborate dry cleaning rituals. The poor developed ingenious methods to stay presentable without wasting precious fuel on heating water. Everyone agreed that cleanliness was important in theory, but found countless reasons to avoid it in practice, a hypocrisy as timeless as body odor itself. When modern observers scoff at medieval bathing habits, they miss the nuanced reality. These weren't people reveling in filth, but practical souls making the best of limited options. Between frozen wells, medical fears, and the sheer labor involved, sometimes not bathing was the most rational choice, even if it did make Sunday Mass a more aromatic experience for all concerned. The true miracle isn't that they sometimes smelled, but that they ever managed to get clean at all. Chapter 10. Perfume over purity. In the olfactory battlefield of 14th century Europe, where the stench of unwashed bodies competed with the reek of open sewers and rotting food, perfume became both weapon and armor. The medieval solution to bodily odors wasn't necessarily to remove them, but to overwhelm with something stronger, a philosophy that transformed personal scent into an art form as elaborate as it was occasionally nauseating. The wealthy led the charge in this aromatic arms race. A noble's perfume cabinet might contain dozens of vials. Rose water from Damascus, civet from Ethiopia, ambergris harvested from whale vomit along northern shores. These precious essences were mixed by perfumers into signature scents that announced one's presence long before entering a room. The Duke of Burgundy employed a personal perfumer, whose sole job was ensuring his grace never smelled like anything less than a walking garden, with different blends for morning, evening, and special occasions. His siege scent, allegedly strong enough to mask the stench of battlefields, was said to make nearby birds fall from trees. For those without access to exotic imports, local alternatives flourished. Lavender from monastery gardens, rosemary crushed with wine, violets steeped in vinegar. Every household had its own recipes for combating odor. A thriving cottage industry of scent balls emerged, pomanders made from perforated metal cases containing wax-encased mixtures of spices and herbs. Wealthier versions used gold filigree and precious gems, while peasants made do with hollowed apples, stuffed with whatever strong-smelling botanicals they could forage. The truly desperate simply rubbed onions under their arms, preferring sharp vegetable odors to human musk. The application methods were as creative as the scents themselves. Perfumed gloves became essential accessories after a tanner supposedly discovered that leather soaked in floral waters could mask the smell of his profession. Soon every lady of quality wore scented gloves, the fragrance renewing each time hands grew warm. Scented beads were sewn into clothing linings, releasing their perfume with body heat. Hair powders made from orris root not only absorbed oil, but left a faint violet trail wherever the wearer went. One particularly extravagant countess had her maids sprinkle rosewater before her as she walked, creating an invisible carpet of fragrance to separate her from common smells. The Church, ever ambivalent about bodily matters, both condemned and embraced perfume. Some clerics railed against scented oils as vanity, while others sanctioned their use to mask the stench of unwashed pilgrims crowding shrines. Monasteries became unexpected centers of perfumery, with monks distilling medicinal waters that doubled as personal fragrances. A Franciscan in Cologne developed a poverty perfume made from pine needles and wood smoke that supposedly smelled like saintly austerity, though his brothers noted it mostly just smelled like a forest fire. Medical theories gave perfume an unexpected legitimacy. The prevailing miasma theory held that disease spread through foul air, so strong pleasant smells were thought to actually purify the atmosphere. During plague outbreaks, people walked the streets with pomanders pressed to their noses, believing the spices warded off infection. Doctors wore beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, looking like sinister birds but smelling like Christmas. Wealthy households burned juniper and thyme in their hearths, preferring choking smoke to imagined contagion. The middle classes developed their own signature scents through occupational necessity. Bakers favored cinnamon to mask flour dust. Butchers carried cloves to combat blood odors. Tanners rubbed mint under their noses to endure the stench of urine-soaked hides. Prostitutes famously used a cheap musk called adulterer's spice that could be smelled across market squares, giving rise to the saying you could smell her virtue before you saw her face. Perfume's power went beyond mere masking. It became a language unto itself. Different flowers conveyed different messages: marjoram for mourning, jasmine for seduction, rosemary for remembrance. A suitor might send a scented handkerchief as a romantic gesture, while enemies exchanged insulting bouquets of foul-smelling herbs. At the French court, a nobleman's refusal to wear perfume was seen as an act of aggression, a silent declaration that others weren't worth smelling pleasant for. The darker side of this scented world emerged in its extremes. Some nobles became so accustomed to heavy perfumes that they could no longer tolerate natural smells, fainting at the scent of fresh air. The king of Navarre reportedly couldn't eat unless his food was lightly perfumed, making every meal taste like potpourri. At the other end of the spectrum, the poor sometimes over-applied cheap fragrances in desperate attempts to appear wealthier, creating choking clouds around themselves that were arguably worse than their natural odor. By century's end, Europe had developed a full-fledged culture of olfactory deception, where the appearance of cleanliness mattered more than the reality. The wealthy took pride in never smelling human, the middle classes aspired to smell expensive, and the poor just tried not to smell like death. It was a system built entirely on pretense, but one that paved the way for modern perfumery, proving that sometimes the most enduring solutions aren't those that solve problems, but those that help us pretend they don't exist. Chapter 11. The Great Unwashed. A misnomer. The persistent image of the filthy medieval peasant scratching at flea bites while trailing a cloud of stench says more about modern prejudices than historical reality. While 14th century commoners certainly lacked modern plumbing, they developed ingenious hygiene practices that kept them far cleaner than contemporary chroniclers, mostly wealthy clergy and nobility, would have us believe. The truth reveals a pragmatic approach to cleanliness that would put many modern festival-goers to shame. Morning hygiene began with the simplest of rituals, the face wash. Even the poorest cottager would start the day by splashing their face with water from the household bucket, using their hands as a makeshift basin. Those who could spare the resources might use a coarse linen cloth to scrub away sleep and night sweats. Archaeological finds from peasant dwellings frequently include small personal washing bowls, suggesting this daily ablution was nearly universal. The truly fastidious would follow with a mouth rinse of water or vinegar, though tooth cleaning remained primitive by modern standards. Hand washing before meals was another widespread practice, enforced both by social custom and practical experience. Peasants might not have understood germ theory, but they recognized that dirty hands made bread taste of soil and could spread illness. In some villages, the communal bread loaf came with strict rules about hand cleanliness before touching it, enforced through social shaming or even small fines. Parents drilled children in proper hand-washing technique, just as they taught them to sew straight furrows, both being essential survival skills. The weekly wash was a more involved affair, usually timed to coincide with the Sabbath. Families would heat a single large pot of water over the hearth, adding whatever cleansing agents they could afford, often homemade soap from ashes and animal fat, though some villages had access to coarse but effective lye soap from nearby monasteries. Bath order followed strict hierarchy. Father first, then mother, then children by age, with babies last in what had become an essentially warm broth. The whole process was efficient rather than leisurely, with each family member getting their turn while the water still retained some heat. Clothing hygiene often surpassed bodily cleanliness, as linen undergarments could be washed more frequently than wool outer layers. The peasant wardrobe system relied on this layered approach, washable linen shifts and braids worn next to the skin, absorbing sweat and oils, while expensive woolen tunics and gowns were worn until obviously dirty. Village washing days saw women beating linens at the streamside, using wooden paddles and sand to grind out stains in a process that was part laundry, part upper body workout. Hair care followed its own practical logic. While full hair washing might happen only monthly, daily brushing with wood or horn combs helped distribute oils and remove parasites. Young girls often wore their hair tightly braided to keep it clean longer, while married women covered theirs with linen wimples that could be washed separately. Men typically cropped their hair short for practicality, though some regions favored longer styles maintained with regular vinegar rinses to kill lice. The peasant approach to dental hygiene, while primitive, showed surprising awareness. Chewing sticks of hazel or willow provided some mechanical cleaning, while herbal mouth rinses made from mint or sage offered temporary freshness. Some rural healers recommended rubbing teeth with a cloth dipped in wine or vinegar, an acidic approach that likely did more harm than good in the long run. Bad teeth were common, but not universal, with skeletal evidence showing many peasants maintained decent dental health through diet and whatever cleaning methods they practiced. Foot care was another area of practical hygiene. After long days working in fields, peasants would wash their feet in buckets of warm water, sometimes adding herbs like thyme for their antiseptic properties. Leather shoes were stuffed with dried meadow grass that could be replaced regularly, acting as primitive insoles that absorbed sweat and odor. Winter brought special challenges, as frozen streams made washing difficult and tight boots led to fungal infections, though the cold at least kept the smell somewhat contained. Seasonal changes dictated hygiene routines. Summer meant more frequent washing in streams and ponds, while winter restricted cleaning to hurried sponge baths by the hearth. Spring's arrival was marked by the Great Wash, when families would launder all their winter bedding and heavy clothes in preparation for warmer weather. Autumn saw a similar cleaning frenzy before the onset of cold, as people prepared for months of limited washing opportunities. The communal aspects of peasant hygiene often went unnoticed by elite observers. Villages maintained strict rules about waste disposal and water sources, with severe penalties for those who fouled shared wells or washing streams. Many settlements had designated areas for laundry, butchering, and other messy tasks, keeping these activities separate from living spaces. The idea that peasants wallowed in filth says more about aristocratic disgust than historical reality. While certainly not up to modern standards, medieval villagers understood the connection between cleanliness and health far better than they're typically credited. What emerges from the evidence is a picture of pragmatic cleanliness adapted to challenging circumstances. Peasants might not have bathed daily in scented water like nobles, but they developed sustainable hygiene practices that balanced limited resources with genuine concern for health and social standing. The great Unwashed were in fact quite particular about their cleanliness. They simply washed on their own terms, with methods suited to their lives of relentless labor. The true irony lies in comparing peasant hygiene to that of their social superiors. While nobles might enjoy perfumed baths and imported soaps, their elaborate hairstyles and heavy velvets often harbored more lice and required more effort to clean than a peasant's simple linen and wool. The medieval commoner might not have smelled like roses, but neither did reek quite as dramatically as history has painted them. Their hygiene was, like everything else in their lives, a matter of making do, and they did far better than most modern people would under similar circumstances. Chapter 12. Bathing in Literature and Law. The medieval relationship with bathing extended far beyond the physical act, weaving itself into the legal codes and literary imagination of the 14th century in ways both predictable and bizarre. From sumptuary laws regulating bathhouse attire to allegorical poems, where cleanliness became spiritual metaphor, bathing occupied a peculiar space in medieval thought, simultaneously mundane and deeply symbolic, strictly controlled yet endlessly debated. The legal landscape surrounding bathing revealed society's preoccupations in unexpected ways. In London, a 1351 ordinance prohibited bathhouse operators from heating water on Sundays, not for religious reasons, but because the fires required too much scarce firewood. Parisian laws dictated separate bathing hours for men and women, though enforcement proved as porous as the linen sheets separating the tubs. Venice took the extraordinary step of banning all bathing during outbreaks of plague, while simultaneously mandating that physicians wash their hands before seeing patients, a contradiction that perfectly captured medieval medicine's confused relationship with cleanliness. Bathhouses became frequent targets of legislative anxiety. Strasbourg's town council required all such establishments to close by curfew, less out of concern for bathers' health than because the late-night gatherings had become covers for gambling rings. In Florence, an obscure law forbade knights from wearing armor in bathhouses, suggesting someone had tried this ill-considered combination with predictably rusty results. The most peculiar regulation came from Cologne, where a statute mandated that public baths must provide separate tubs for lepers, but specified these should be positioned downwind and painted with red crosses. Hygiene theater at its most performative. Literary depictions of bathing ranged from pious to salacious. Religious texts often used bathing as metaphor for spiritual purification, with prayer books comparing confession to a bath for the soul. This imagery reached its zenith in the popular bathing of the child Jesus stories, where the Virgin Mary's preparation of a bath for the infant Christ became an allegory for baptism. Monastic scribes produced elaborate illuminated manuscripts showing biblical figures bathing with surprising anatomical accuracy, their modesty preserved only by strategically placed steam clouds. Secular literature took a decidedly earthier approach. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales included several bawdy references to bathing, including a miller who knew the remedies of love, for he could wash both tub and towel. Romance novels of the period frequently used bath scenes as opportunities for seduction, complete with helpful servants who conveniently forgot which chambers they were supposed to guard. The most notorious example, the Bathhouse Tales, circulated in handwritten copies among the nobility, its thinly veiled eroticism wrapped in the pretense of medical advice about the healthful properties of warm water. Medical texts offered perhaps the strangest bathing commentaries. One 14th century physician's manual included detailed instructions for fumigation baths, where patients sat naked over pits of boiling herbs, while doctors debated whether the steam should enter through the pores or other orifices. Surgical guides recommended operating on patients while they were immersed in warm water, creating a gruesome combination of bath and butcher's block. Even veterinary texts got in on the act, with treatments for horses that involved leading the beast into the sea until its humors balance, a prescription that must have puzzled inland stable masters. Court records revealed bathing's role in both crime and punishment. Several cases documented thieves caught stealing clothes from unattended bathhouses, their dripping footprints leading guards straight to their hideyouts. In one peculiar German trial, a man was fined for disturbing the peace with excessive bathing after neighbors complained about his daily singing during morning ablutions. More seriously, bathhouses occasionally became crime scenes themselves, as in the notorious 1378 case where a Venetian nobleman was murdered in his tub by business rivals who had bribed the bath attendant. The law even intervened in marital bathing habits. Several surviving marriage contracts specified bathing rights, particularly for noblewomen whose elaborate grooming rituals required significant resources. One countess's dowry agreement guaranteed her weekly access to sufficient hot water for her personal use, not to exceed 2 barrels. Conversely, some husbands included clauses forbidding wives from visiting public bathhouses unchaperoned, less out of concern for virtue than fear they'd gossip away family secrets in the steam rooms. Religious authorities produced their own contradictory literature on bathing. While some sermon collections praised cleanliness as next to godliness, others warned that excessive bathing could lead to vanity. One particularly zealous friar wrote a treatise claiming the devil lurked in bathhouse steam, waiting to enter bathers through their open pores. This didn't stop monasteries from maintaining their own elaborate bathing facilities, of course. One abbot justified his institution's marble bathhouse as necessary to cleanse the body so the soul may better focus on prayer. The most fascinating legal bathing intersection appeared in inheritance disputes. Several cases turned on whether someone had been of sound mind when making bath-related bequests, like the Florentine merchant who left his entire fortune to maintain the public baths where he'd found his greatest earthly joy. In London, an extended court battle erupted over whether a bathhouse counted as real property or movable goods when dividing an estate. The judge ultimately ruled it depended on whether the tubs were fixed to the ground, a decision that created more problems than it solved. Artistic depictions of bathing ranged from devotional to scandalous. Church frescoes showed biblical baptisms with carefully placed drapery, while secular tapestries depicted bath scenes so frank they were often kept in private chambers. A famous set of French playing cards from the period used bathing suits as the suit symbols, leading to at least one recorded case of cards being confiscated from a monastery where monks had become overly attached to the Queen of Tubs. By century's end, bathing had become encoded in law and literature as something far more complex than mere hygiene. It was a social activity to regulate, a spiritual metaphor to explore, a medical treatment to debate, and occasionally a narrative device for less elevated purposes. The very contradictions in how bathing appeared in texts reflected the medieval world's conflicted relationship with the body itself, both temple and temptation, in need of cleansing but prone to indulgence. Perhaps the final word belongs to an anonymous scribe who, in the margin of a legal manuscript, doodled a tiny picture of a judge in a bathtub, complete with floating gavel. Below it he wrote, "The law cleans all, but who cleans the law?" It was as good a summary as any of how the medieval mind saw bathing, not just as physical act, but as lens through which to examine every facet of human life, from the sacred to the profane. Chapter 13. The steamy side of bathing. In the dim, misty world of medieval bathhouses, where steam curled around wooden beams and laughter echoed off whetstones, propriety floated away as easily as soap bubbles. These establishments, ostensibly built for hygiene, became the theaters of scandal, where the combination of warm water, dim lighting, and relaxed social rules created the perfect conditions for romantic escapades and illicit dealings. The bathhouse was where society's boundaries became deliciously blurred, where a nobleman might find himself shoulder to shoulder with a merchant's wife, both wrapped in nothing but shared secrets and wisps of vapor. The design of bathhouses practically encouraged intrigue. Private chambers could be rented by the hour, their curtains providing just enough privacy to be suggestive without being definitive. The main soaking pools, while technically public, became a swirl of bodies where hands might accidentally brush underwater, where knees might knock together beneath the surface, all with plausible deniability. In the humid air, flushed cheeks could be blamed on the heat, lingering touches excused as helping someone steady themselves on slippery floors. Bathhouse attendants played their own role in these dramas. Many doubled as go-betweens, passing notes between patrons or arranging chance meetings in secluded corners. Some establishments employed musicians whose loud playing conveniently covered other sounds from private rooms. The more luxurious bathhouses even maintained secret passageways and alternate exits, architectural winks to the establishment's true secondary purpose. In Paris, one infamous bathhouse owner kept a ledger of which patrons used these back routes and when, information that proved unexpectedly useful during later blackmail attempts. The line between bath attendant and sex worker was often deliberately vague. Many bathhouse employees offered special services for extra coin, their job descriptions expanding to include whatever clients might desire. Municipal records list frequent fines for establishments where this practice became too overt, though the punishments were light enough to suggest authorities viewed it as more of a licensing issue than a moral crisis. In some cities, bathhouses paid regular bribes to local officials to maintain this profitable ambiguity. Romantic literature of the period overflowed with bathhouse trysts. Popular poems told of knights recognizing their beloveds by birthmarks glimpsed through steam, of married women arranging assignations while supposedly taking medicinal waters. One particularly scandalous romance told of a lady who hid her lover in a large chest, supposedly containing bath herbs, only for the tryst to be interrupted when an actual herbalist came to retrieve his supply. The story circulated widely, spawning countless imitations and at least one documented case of a jealous husband inspecting all bathhouse cupboards before allowing his wife to enter. The medical establishment unwittingly fueled the bathhouse's romantic reputation. Physicians frequently prescribed bathing for hysterical conditions in women and melancholic humors in men, diagnoses broad enough to cover everything from actual illness to simple sexual frustration. Young widows in particular seemed prone to these bath-prescribed ailments, visiting steam rooms with suspicious frequency. Apothecaries near bathhouses did brisk business selling restorative tonics that were mostly wine with a few herbs tossed in for plausible deniability. Nobility took bathhouse intrigue to extravagant levels. The Duke of Berry maintained a private bathing suite with hidden alcoves where he could spy on his guests at leisure. The Countess of Artois famously received suitors while bathing, conducting politics and flirtations from behind a strategically placed screen of rose-scented steam. Her rival, the Duchess of Burgundy, took the opposite approach. She banned all baths in her household for a year after discovering 3 separate plots against her life that had been hatched in the relaxed atmosphere of her own bathing chambers. For the less privileged, bathhouses offered rare opportunities for social climbing. A clever merchant's daughter might arrange to be bathing when a nobleman visited, allowing nature and damp linen to take its course. Young clerks found bathhouses ideal places to impress potential patrons, showing off their education while strategically revealing muscular shoulders. Even clergy weren't immune, though they were supposed to frequent special monastic bathhouses. Many preferred the livelier atmosphere of public establishments, where theological debates could be seasoned with gossip and the occasional glimpse of worldly pleasure. The bathhouse's reputation as a den of vice wasn't entirely undeserved. Police records from multiple cities list bathhouses as frequent sites of gambling, petty theft, and occasional violence. One Parisian case involved a duel fought entirely in a bathing chamber, the combatants slipping and sliding while spectators placed bets on who would fall first. Another report describes a group of students who turned their bathhouse into an impromptu theater, performing lewd plays for an audience of equally drunk classmates until the proprietor threw them all out into the snow. Yet, for all the scandal, many bathhouse romances led to legitimate marriages. The relaxed atmosphere allowed potential partners to see each other informally, to converse without the usual chaperones hovering nearby. Several surviving letters between couples reference their first meeting in bathhouses, the steam having provided a veil of privacy for initial flirtations. One particularly touching set of correspondence between a wool merchant and his future wife describes their weekly bathhouse visits as the only time they could speak freely before their wedding. The church's periodic crackdowns on bathhouses only added to their allure. When bishops banned mixed-gender bathing, patrons simply developed more creative methods of circumvention. Separate entrances that joined inside, overlapping bathing times that left the pools conveniently occupied by both sexes simultaneously. Some establishments installed chastity bars down the middle of their pools, which promptly became the sites of hand-holding beneath the water's surface. By the late 14th century, the bathhouse had cemented its dual identity as both cleansing institution and den of iniquity. The same steam that purged dirt from pores seemed to loosen social constraints as well, creating a space where people could be, for a few warm hours, slightly more honest and slightly less proper than everyday life allowed. It was this very humanity, the recognition that beneath all the layers of clothing and social pretense, everyone was just a body in need of washing, that made bathhouses equally beloved and scandalous. For every sermon condemning their immorality, there were a dozen whispered stories of bathhouse romances. For every law passed to regulate their operation, there were 100 clever workarounds. The steam might eventually dissipate, the water grow cold, but the bathhouse's reputation as a place where rules softened along with muscles would persist long after the medieval period ended. It was, in its own damp way, one of the most democratic spaces of the Middle Ages, a place where, once the clothes came off, everyone was equally human, equally vulnerable, and equally prone to mischief given the right combination of warm water and opportunity. Chapter 14. From Bath to Plague. A Misguided Connection. When the Black Death began its relentless march across Europe in the mid-14th century, medieval society desperately sought explanations for the unfathomable devastation. In their frantic search for causes, they landed upon an unfortunate scapegoat, the humble bath. This misguided association between cleanliness and contagion would reshape hygiene practices for generations, tarnishing the reputation of bathing with pseudoscientific theories that persisted long after the plague subsided. Long after the plague subsided. The connection seemed logical to medieval minds working within the flawed framework of humoral theory. Physicians taught that hot baths opened the pores, creating vulnerable entry points for corrupted air, the feared miasma believed to carry disease. As plague deaths mounted, terrified populations scrutinized every behavior that might invite the invisible killer. The public bathhouse, with its warm, moist air and crowded conditions, perfectly fit their profile of danger. Never mind that rats and fleas cared little for human bathing habits, the coincidence proved too tempting to ignore. This fear manifested in sudden, dramatic ways. Municipal authorities shuttered bathhouses first as precautionary measures, then as permanent bans. The great bathing establishments of Paris, London, and Cologne stood empty, their copper tubs gathering dust, while their former attendants fled to the countryside. In Florence, officials went so far as to brick up the doors of bathhouses, as if the buildings themselves were vectors of disease rather than simple gathering places. Wealthy families dismantled private bathing chambers, filling tubs with stored grain rather than water. The medical profession fueled these fears with contradictory advice. Some physicians declared bathing outright deadly during plague times, while others permitted limited washing if done with cold water and vinegar. A particularly influential treatise claimed the only safe way to bathe was while wearing a specially treated woolen gown that prevented water from touching the skin directly. An impractical suggestion that nonetheless spawned a brief fashion for bathing tunics among the paranoid wealthy. Religious authorities added their own spin to the anti-bathing crusade. Preachers connected the plague to moral decay, conveniently recalling bathhouses' reputations for impropriety. What began as medical caution morphed into moral condemnation, with some clerics proclaiming the epidemic divine punishment for sensual indulgence. The Bishop of London famously declared, "Better to smell of honest sweat than to bathe in the devil's broth," a sentiment that resonated with terrified congregations. Ironically, the abandonment of bathing likely worsened public health. Without regular washing, skin conditions flourished. Lice and fleas found ideal breeding grounds in unwashed clothing and hair, potentially aiding the very plague spread they sought to prevent. The wealthy, who could afford more frequent changes of linen, fared better than the poor who had to wear the same clothes for months, a fact that only reinforced the mistaken belief that dirt provided protection. The working classes adapted in practical, if unhygienic, ways. The dry bath became commonplace, rubbing the body with coarse linen cloths to remove surface dirt, while preserving the skin's protective layer. Vinegar rinses replaced proper washing for hands and faces. Perfume use skyrocketed, as people attempted to mask their declining cleanliness with ever stronger scents. A new class of stink apothecaries specialized in powerful odor-masking compounds, their shops doing brisk business while soap makers starved. The nobility's relationship with bathing became fraught with contradiction. While publicly eschewing baths as dangerous, many aristocrats maintained secret washing rituals. The Duke of Berry's household accounts show payments for large quantities of soap during the height of plague fears, alongside public declarations that he hadn't bathed in years. Similar discrepancies appeared across Europe: private cleansing for health, public dirtying for show. Medical professionals noticed an unexpected consequence of the bathing panic. Physicians who washed between patients seemed to contract plague less often. This observation led to quiet experimentation: water mixed with vinegar for hand rinsing, herbal steam inhalations, even discreet sponge baths for those brave enough to risk it. These practices couldn't be openly discussed, given the climate of fear, but they planted seeds for later hygienic reforms. The bathhouse workers, suddenly unemployed, became unlikely plague caregivers. Their knowledge of heating water and handling linens made them natural nurses, though they faced suspicion from those who still associated their former trade with disease. Many reinvented themselves as water therapists, offering private treatments to wealthy clients, willing to risk cleanliness for supposed health benefits. By the time the worst plague waves passed, the damage to bathing's reputation was done. Generations had grown up associating immersion in water with disease and death. Public bathhouses never fully regained their former popularity, their numbers dwindling to a fraction of pre-plague levels. The elaborate bathing culture of the early 14th century became a memory, replaced by perfumes and linen changes as the new standards of cleanliness. The great irony, of course, was that the abandonment of bathing had done nothing to stop the plague. Cities that banned bathhouses died just as thoroughly as those that maintained them. The wealthy who avoided washing succumbed alongside the poor who couldn't. The real culprits, rats, fleas, and the Yersinia pestis bacterium, continued their work unimpeded by human bathing habits. Yet the myth persisted, woven into medical texts and popular wisdom. It would take centuries for bathing to shake its dangerous reputation, and even then the ghost of plague-era fears occasionally resurfaced during later epidemics. The Black Death claimed many victims beyond those who died. Among them, for generations, the simple pleasure and health benefits of a good hot bath. In the end, the story of bathing and plague serves as a cautionary tale about how easily fear can distort reason, how readily humans abandon effective practices in favor of false security. The medieval world, faced with unimaginable horror, grasped for control wherever it could, even if that meant blaming the very act of washing for its woes. The bath became collateral damage in humanity's struggle to comprehend the incomprehensible, its reputation unfairly sullied by circumstances far beyond its steam-filled chambers. Chapter 15. The Tools of the Trade. A medieval bather's toolkit would baffle most modern spa-goers, an assortment of implements ranging from the practical to the perplexing, each designed to tackle the challenges of cleanliness in an era without running water or antibacterial soap. These objects tell a story not just of hygiene, but of social status, medical beliefs, and the daily realities of keeping clean when even hot water was a luxury. The most ubiquitous tool was the washing cloth, though nothing like the fluffy terry cloth we'd recognize today. Medieval washcloths were typically squares of coarse linen or hemp, often repurposed from worn-out garments. The wealthier classes might use softer linen with embroidered edges, but even these were rough by modern standards. These cloths served multiple purposes, exfoliating skin, applying soap, and scrubbing hard-to-reach areas. Some households kept different grades of cloth for different body parts, with the softest reserved for faces and the coarsest for feet. Bathing combs were essential for battling the ever-present lice and nits. Made from wood, bone, or ivory, these double-sided implements featured widely spaced teeth on one end for detangling, and fine-spaced teeth on the other for parasite removal. The combs' designs reveal much about medieval grooming habits. Many had long handles for reaching the back of the head, while others featured ornate carvings suggesting they were valued personal possessions. Some even had secret compartments in the handles for storing delousing ointments. The strigil, a curved metal scraping tool inherited from Roman bathing culture, remained popular throughout the medieval period. Used to remove oil, dirt, and dead skin after bathing, these implements ranged from simple iron designs to elaborate silver versions for the nobility. The scraping technique required practice, too gentle, and it did nothing, too vigorous, and it left angry red streaks. Bathhouse attendants became skilled in their use, offering full stridulation services that left patrons pink but refreshed. Soap dishes and holders provide some of the most charming archaeological finds, carved from soapstone, which helped keep the soap dry. Wood or even glazed pottery. These small containers often featured drainage holes to prevent the precious soap from dissolving between uses. Wealthier households might own matching sets with separate dishes for different soap types, one for harsh laundry soap, another for gentler body soap, and perhaps a special container for imported perfumed varieties. Ear scoops and nail cleaners, often combined into a single implement, featured in many personal grooming kits. These small metal tools show the medieval attention to detail and hygiene. The scoops carefully curved to avoid damaging the ear canal. The nail cleaners tapered to precise points for digging out dirt. Some particularly fancy versions folded like pocket knives, allowing their owners to carry them discreetly. The humble washing bowl, though simple, represented a major investment for many households. Copper or brass bowls were prized for their ability to retain heat, while ceramic versions offered affordability. The wealthiest might own specialized sets with matching pitchers, their rims often worn from years of use. These bowls served multiple functions: for washing hands and face daily, for soaking feet, and occasionally for full-body sponge baths when proper bathing wasn't possible. Bath brushes, made with bristles from boar or horsehair, were luxury items for most. The stiff bristles could remove dirt effectively but required a high pain tolerance. Many medieval accounts complain of brushes that raised more skin than dirt. Wealthy households might own different brushes for different purposes: soft ones for applying soap, stiff ones for scrubbing backs, and tiny ones for cleaning under nails. Perhaps the most surprising tool was the bathing mantle, a loose hooded robe worn during winter washes. Made from absorbent wool or linen, these garments allowed for modest washing while retaining warmth. Some versions had slits or openings permitting access to different body parts without full exposure to cold air. Inventories from noble households describe lavishly embroidered bathing mantles lined with fur, turning necessity into yet another status symbol. The tools of medieval dental hygiene would make a modern dentist shudder. Chewing sticks of aromatic wood served as primitive toothbrushes, while linen cloths wrapped around fingers became improvised floss. Toothpicks of precious metals or porcupine quills were highly prized personal items, often worn on chains around the neck, as both practical tools and jewelry. Specialized tools existed for every imaginable grooming need. Round-bottomed razors for shaving heads and beards, tiny spoons for cleaning wax from ears, even curved implements for scraping calluses from feet. Each reflects the very human concern with personal appearance and cleanliness. Many of these tools were passed down through generations, their handles worn smooth from decades of use. The bathhouse toolkit was particularly specialized. Attendants carried wooden pails for pouring water, copper ladles for adding hot water to tubs, and long-handled back scrubbers for hard-to-reach areas. Some establishments maintained collections of guest tools for patrons who hadn't brought their own, though these communal implements probably spread as many problems as they solved. For the wealthy, bathing became an opportunity to display elaborate grooming sets, often contained in fitted wooden cases with compartments for each implement. These sets might include ear spoons, nail cleaners, combs, and small scissors, all made from matching materials. Some noble women's sets included tiny silver pots for storing beauty creams and perfumed oils. The poor made do with far less, perhaps a single wooden comb, a scrap of cloth, and shared family soap. Yet archaeological finds suggest even peasant households valued personal grooming tools, often crafting them from whatever materials were available. A shepherd might carve a comb from antler, while a fisherman could fashion ear cleaners from fish bones. These tools, now silent in museum cases, once played vital roles in daily life. The grooves worn into a bonecomb's teeth tell of countless hours spent battling lice. The smoothed edges of a wooden washing bowl speak of generations of use. Together they paint a picture of a society that, despite limited technology, cared deeply about cleanliness and presentation, and developed ingenious tools to achieve it with the materials at hand. The medieval approach to bathing tools reveals a fundamental truth. Cleanliness has always been as much about ritual as practicality. Whether using a silver-backed brush or a rough hemp cloth, the act of washing connected people across social classes to a shared human experience. The desire to feel fresh, presentable, and perhaps just a little bit pampered, even in an age far removed from modern conveniences. Chapter 16. Bathing Across Borders. While 14th century Europe wavered between embracing and abandoning its bathing traditions, other civilizations were perfecting the art of cleanliness with approaches that would have shocked medieval Christians and fascinated them in equal measure. From the steam-filled hammams of the Islamic world to the elaborate ritual baths of Japan, hygiene practices across the globe revealed cultural values and technological innovations that made European habits seem alternately prudish and excessive by comparison. The Islamic world maintained bathing traditions that would have made Roman emperors feel at home. Public baths, or hammams, served as community centers where business, politics, and socializing unfolded amid the steam. Unlike their increasingly scandalous European counterparts, Islamic bathhouses maintained strict gender separation and emphasized spiritual purity as much as physical cleanliness. Visitors followed a precise sequence, moving from warm room to hot room to steam chamber, each step accompanied by rigorous scrubbing. Attendants known as telex performed full-body exfoliations with rough mitts, leaving bathers pink and renewed. The wealthy might follow this with massage and perfuming, emerging not just clean but transformed. These establishments were architectural marvels too, with domed ceilings designed to drip condensation away from bathers and intricate tile work that soothed the eye while the body relaxed. Water itself held sacred significance in Islamic culture, with elaborate fountains and ablution pools gracing every mosque. The ritual washing before prayers, while not a full bath, ensured even the poorest maintained basic hygiene. European travelers often remarked with surprise on this devotion to cleanliness, some praising it while others dismissed it as excessive. What none could deny was the result. Cities like Cordoba and Damascus smelled markedly better than their European counterparts, a fact many visitors attributed not to culture but to climate until they saw the elaborate public baths and water systems. In Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire preserved Roman bathing traditions, even as Western Europe forgot them. The great thermae of Constantinople functioned much as they had centuries earlier, with vast heated pools and skilled attendants. Byzantine physicians prescribed specific bathing regimens for different ailments, their recommendations more sophisticated than anything in the West. The imperial baths contained separate sections for different social classes, though the water flowed equally for all, a small democratic mercy in an otherwise rigid hierarchy. East Asia presented entirely different bathing philosophies. In Japan, the Sento public baths and onsen hot springs were places of quiet contemplation rather than boisterous socializing. The ritual involved thorough washing before entering shared soaking pools, a practice that conserved water while maintaining hygiene. Japanese monks took this further, viewing bathing as spiritual exercise where cleansing the body mirrored purification of the soul. Their bathhouses often contained Buddha statues, transforming hygiene into devotion. The wealthy built elaborate home baths with wooden tubs designed for soaking rather than washing, their heated water a precious commodity. China's bath culture varied dramatically by region and class. In the south, public bathhouses offered similar services to Islamic hammams, with scraping and massage alongside washing. Northerners, facing scarcer water resources, often made do with sponge baths, except for weekly visits to bathhouses. The Chinese developed an entire philosophy of hot water therapy, with different temperatures prescribed for different seasons and constitutions. Medical texts recommended adding herbs to bath water to treat everything from joint pain to excess melancholy, creating a tradition that would evolve into modern traditional Chinese medicine practices. India's approach to bathing centered on sacred rivers, particularly the Ganges, where millions still perform ritual cleansings today. Hindu texts prescribe detailed washing rituals tied to spiritual practice, with specific techniques for different castes and occasions. Unlike the steamy bathhouses of other cultures, Indian bathing was often conducted in open air. The wealthier households maintained private washing areas with elaborate drainage systems. The use of cleansing oils before washing, a practice called abhyanga, created a skincare routine Europeans wouldn't discover for centuries. The contrast with Europe became starkest when examining attitudes toward nudity. While medieval Christians increasingly associated nakedness with shame, many other cultures viewed the unclothed body in bathing contexts with pragmatic acceptance. Japanese bathers thought nothing of communal nakedness. Islamic bathhouses used discreet draping when necessary, and Indian river washers wore minimal clothing without fuss. Only Europeans seemed torn between medical recommendations to wash thoroughly and moral panic about what might happen when people saw each other without clothes. Water technology revealed equally glaring disparities. While European cities struggled with contaminated wells, Constantinople's enormous underground cisterns and the Islamic world's sophisticated aqueducts ensured clean water supplies. Chinese engineers built elaborate pipe systems from bamboo and ceramic, some capable of delivering heated water to imperial baths. The Persian Qanat system, underground channels that brought mountain water to arid cities, made public baths possible in regions where Europe would have abandoned washing entirely. Perhaps most telling was how different cultures incorporated bathing into daily life. For Muslims, washing preceded prayers 5 times daily. In Japan, a quick evening bath was as routine as eating. Indian Brahmins performed ritual ablutions multiple times a day. Only in Europe did washing become optional and then, after the plague, nearly abandoned. Even the Byzantine Christians who shared Europe's faith maintained better hygiene than their Western cousins, proving religion wasn't the deciding factor. Trade routes carried bathing innovations across continents, though Europe often resisted them. The Crusaders encountered hammams in the Holy Land and returned with tales of Eastern cleanliness, though they focused more on the supposed licentiousness than the engineering marvels. Marco Polo's descriptions of Chinese bathhouses were dismissed as fantastical exaggerations. Only a few imported practices caught on. The use of rosewater in elite European courts, for instance, or the adoption of Turkish-style steam treatments for certain medical conditions. The 14th century's global bathing practices reveal a world where cleanliness meant profoundly different things. For some, it was spiritual duty. For others, medical necessity or simple pleasure. What united them all was the basic human understanding that water cleansed more than just skin. It refreshed the mind, restored the body, and connected people across cultures through the universal need to wash away the grime of daily life. Europe, in its eventual rejection of bathing, stood increasingly alone in a world that still saw value in coming clean. As the century waned, this divergence would have consequences. Societies that maintained robust bathing traditions tended toward greater stability and public health. Stronger communal bonds forged in shared washing spaces, and more advanced water technologies that would drive further innovation. Europe, by contrast, entered its early modern period with a troubled relationship to cleanliness that would take centuries to repair, all because it forgot what the rest of the world still knew, that how a society washes itself reveals much about how it values its people. Chapter 17. The Slow Return to Cleanliness. The decades following the Black Death saw Europe's relationship with bathing begin a gradual thaw, like ice cracking on a medieval stream in early spring. What began as tentative reappraisals of water's benefits would eventually blossom into the more robust hygiene practices of the Renaissance. Though the path back to cleanliness wound through medical debates, social anxieties, and no small amount of lingering superstition. The first cracks in the anti-bathing orthodoxy appeared where they often do, among the medical community. A new generation of physicians, less wedded to humoral theory's extremes, began cautiously recommending limited washing for certain conditions. Their texts contain careful caveats. Water should be tepid rather than hot. Bathing should last no longer than it took to recite 3 paternosters, and the bather must immediately wrap themselves in woolen cloths afterward to seal the pores. These hesitant recommendations gained traction as plague recurrences failed to correlate with bathing habits, undermining the miasma theory's stranglehold on medical thought. Wealthy households led the return to regular washing, as they could afford the fuel and labor required for safe, private bathing. Inventories from 15th century Italian palazzos show a resurgence of bathing equipment. Copper tubs with built-in stools for seated washing, elaborate systems for heating and pouring water, and specialized rooms with proper drainage. The Medici family installed a stufa or steam room in their Florentine palace, its walls lined with aromatic cedar to create a more refined atmosphere than old public bathhouses. This private bathing revolution allowed elites to wash without risking their reputations in questionable establishments. The church's stance softened as well, particularly after the Western schism undermined papal authority. Local bishops began permitting bathhouses to reopen, provided they maintained separate hours for men and women and displayed appropriate religious imagery. Some monastic orders quietly resumed their traditional washing practices, framing them as spiritual discipline rather than indulgence. A German abbot famously defended his monastery's baths by arguing that clean hands prepare purer hosts, though his real motivation may have been the aching joints of his elderly monks. New bathing technologies made washing more accessible. Improved wood-burning heaters could warm water faster using less fuel, while lead piping systems, though dangerously toxic by modern standards, allowed some wealthy homes to create primitive running water arrangements. The invention of better soap formulations, particularly in Castile and Marseille, made cleansing more effective and pleasant. These advances trickled down slowly. A merchant's wife might enjoy a proper bath monthly where her grandmother had settled for sponge washes. The return of public bathing came more hesitantly. Those bathhouses that reopened were often redesigned to address plague-era concerns: better ventilation to prevent stagnant air, larger facilities to reduce crowding, and stricter rules about cleaning between users. Some cities instituted licensing systems for bathhouse operators, requiring them to maintain certain standards or face fines. The terminology changed too. These were now more likely to be called washing houses than baths, emphasizing hygiene over leisure. Medical bathing saw particular innovation. The late 15th century obsession with balneotherapy, or medicinal springs, created a new kind of resort culture around Europe's natural thermal waters. Towns like Baden-Baden and Bath reinvented themselves as health destinations, attracting wealthy patrons who combined hydrotherapy with socializing. These spas maintained strict regimens, specific temperatures for different ailments, timed immersions, and prescribed post-bath rest periods, lending an air of scientific legitimacy that helped rehabilitate bathing's reputation. Clothing hygiene advanced faster than personal washing. The increasing availability of cheap linen allowed more frequent changes of undergarments, creating a buffer between body and expensive outerwear. Laundry techniques improved too, with new soap formulations and mechanical washing paddles reducing the labor involved. A well-off burgher's wife might still bathe infrequently, but her linen shifts would be changed and washed regularly, creating a cleaner overall effect. Art and literature reflected these changing attitudes. Paintings began showing domestic bathing scenes again, particularly in childbirth contexts where cleanliness had obvious medical benefits. Romantic poetry rediscovered the erotic potential of the bath without quite crossing into indecency. Even religious art sometimes depicted biblical bathing scenes with new detail and accuracy, signaling the church's quiet acceptance of washing's return. The working classes adapted these trends to their limited means. Communal wash days became more organized affairs, with villages designating specific times for laundry at the stream to prevent dispute. The Saturday night bath entered peasant culture in many regions, becoming a weekly ritual rather than an occasional luxury. Improved home construction meant even modest cottages might now have a dedicated washing corner with proper drainage, rather than just a bucket by the hearth. By century's end, the stage was set for the Renaissance's full-throated embrace of cleanliness. The scientific revolution would soon provide better understanding of hygiene's health benefits, while global trade would introduce new cleansing products and techniques. But this transition owed much to those late medieval pioneers who carefully, cautiously reopened their bathhouses, who dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, water wasn't the enemy after all. Their legacy survives in small details. The copper tubs that began reappearing in wealthy homes, the soap makers' guilds that regained their status, the medical texts that gradually stopped warning about dangerous pores. Most of all, it survives in the simple idea that washing could be both practical and pleasurable, a notion that would have seemed radical in plague-scarred Europe, but which we now take as fundamental as the water in our modern pipes. The return to cleanliness wasn't swift, nor was it uniform. But like water wearing away stone, the persistent human desire to feel fresh and renewed eventually carved out new channels in European culture. After the long dry century of fearing water, the bath was coming back. And with it a little more of what makes us human. Chapter 18. Modern Myths vs. Medieval Reality. Our fascination with medieval bathing says far more about modern anxieties than historical truth. The persistent myth of the filthy Middle Ages reflects not what actually happened, but what we fear we might become without our carefully constructed infrastructure of cleanliness. Like all good myths, it contains a kernel of truth wrapped in layers of exaggeration and misunderstanding, creating a funhouse mirror version of the past that distorts as much as it reveals. The greatest irony lies in how we've inverted reality. Modern people imagine medieval peasants as grime-covered wretches, when in fact they were far more connected to the physical realities of their own cleanliness than we are today. They knew precisely where their water came from, how their soap was made, what their washing rituals cost in labor and resources. Our ancestors may have smelled different, but they weren't ignorant of hygiene. They simply practiced it within the constraints of their world. Consider the bathhouse, so often reduced in popular imagination to either den of vice or pit of filth. In truth, these were complex social spaces where commerce mingled with hygiene, where medical treatment met gossip, where different classes navigated shared experiences of steam and water. We've lost this communal aspect of washing. Our showers are private, our tubs solitary. The medieval approach seems foreign not because it was backward, but because it was profoundly social in ways we no longer understand. Our condescension toward medieval hygiene reveals our own fragility. The thought of living without daily showers horrifies us not because daily showers are necessary. They aren't, biologically, but because we've built personal and social rituals around them. When we sneer at peasants who washed weekly, we're really reassuring ourselves about the rightness of our own habits. The medieval person might well ask why we scrub ourselves raw daily, only to slather on synthetic moisturizers to replace the oils we've stripped away. The Black Death's role in this story proves particularly revealing. We cling to the idea that medieval people abandoned bathing because they were ignorant, when in fact they were responding rationally to limited information. Our own pandemic responses, hoarding toilet paper, disinfecting groceries, debating mask efficacy, show we're no less prone to hygiene panic when frightened. The main difference lies not in our rationality, but in our technology. Modern cleanliness rituals would baffle a medieval observer. They'd marvel at our running water but question why we use drinking quality water to flush waste. They'd find our chemical-laden soaps suspiciously perfumed and wonder why we scrub with plastic loofahs shipped across oceans. The disposable razors, the single-use wipes, the elaborate 12-step skincare routines, all would seem as bizarre to them as their lice cones and ear scoops appear to us. The truth is, medieval people cared about cleanliness as much as we do. They simply expressed it differently within their material and cultural constraints. A peasant woman who meticulously changed her linen underdress was no less hygiene-conscious than a modern office worker with his antibacterial hand gel. A nobleman soaking in rose-scented water wasn't fundamentally different from a spa-goer today paying for an aromatherapy bath. The tools change, the impulse remains. Perhaps what we find most unsettling is how medieval practices blur lines we prefer to keep separate. Their bathhouses mixed health and pleasure in ways that make us uncomfortable. Their medical treatments combined what we'd consider proper hygiene with what we'd call superstition. Even their clean-dirty boundaries were more fluid. The same person who avoided full immersion baths might fastidiously clean their hands before meals, or change their socks regularly. This discomfort says more about our modern compartmentalization than their supposed filth. We've created separate categories for medical hygiene, beauty routines, spiritual cleansing, and social presentation that medieval people would have found artificial. To them, washing could be practical and pleasurable, medicinal and social, all at once. Our need to classify everything reveals our own unease with such ambiguity. The real lesson of medieval bathing isn't about how far we've come, but how consistently human beings across time have sought to care for their bodies within their understanding of the world. Our ancestors weren't dirty because they wanted to be. They were doing their best with the knowledge and resources available. 5 centuries from now, our descendants will likely view our own hygiene rituals with similar bemusement, wondering why we did things the way we did. In the end, the story of medieval bathing is really the story of adaptation. When public baths became suspect, people found other ways to stay clean. When medical theories changed, they adjusted their routines. When new technologies appeared, they incorporated them. This flexibility, this pragmatic response to changing circumstances, is what truly connects us across the centuries. The next time you step into a shower, consider this. Your morning routine is just the latest iteration in humanity's eternal dance with water and cleanliness. The medieval bather would recognize your desire to feel fresh, even if the method seems strange. And who knows, perhaps some future historian will study your shampoo bottle with the same curiosity we now give to a 14th century lice comb. History rarely divides neatly into clean and dirty, advanced and primitive. More often it swirls like steam in a bathhouse, full of contradictions, unexpected connections, and truths that emerge only when we're willing to sit with the discomfort of different ways of being. The past wasn't a simple prelude to our present. It was a complex world where people made choices that made sense to them, just as we do. That, perhaps, is the most valuable lesson the medieval bather can teach us. That cleanliness, like so much else, is never just about removing dirt. It's about who we are, how we live, and what we value. And that's something no amount of historical distance can wash away.